Recently, the provost held a meeting with academic unit leaders, and Grace Novak, who's the student director of the Climate Hub, exhorted academic leaders to get involved in climate change. And I think this is an example of an otherwise not so obvious academic unit, School of Kinesiology, getting involved very concertedly in this important initiative. I'd also like to acknowledge Brian Wilson for his outstanding leadership in the Center for Sport and Sustainability. Done a great job in an ongoing series. I'm just delighted to see what this center is doing within the school and at UBC. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. So as Rob said, I'm Brian Wilson, the director of the UBC Center for Sport and Sustainability, faculty member in kinesiology and also sociologist. So I'm really excited about our panel today and the discussion we'll have about sustainability, sport events, and impact assessments. And as Rob indicated, this is the first in a series of events, and Andrea Bundan will say a little bit about that in closing. But by way of introduction, I'm going to spend a little bit of time thanking some key individuals who helped make this event possible. Rob did a little bit of that, and I'm going to continue, introduce our panel, or at least say a little bit about our panel to start off. Part of the task for the panelists to say a little bit about themselves too, so I won't say too much, but I'll say some. And also to say a little bit about why we've chosen to organize an event in the first place on sport, sustainability, and event impacts, and why we've done this now and here. So I'm going to begin by focusing on this last part for a little while. Why now and why here? So on December 5th, 2019, at a meeting of the Board of Governors for the University of British Columbia, this university, the UBC Declaration on the Climate Emergency was endorsed. With this endorsement, the university recognized, and I'm quoting here straight from the Office of the President website, quote, the need for drastic emissions reductions as laid out by the science of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the UN Production Gap Report, and the Paris Agreement to be achieved via rapid and far-reaching transformations across all economic sectors. The university also acknowledged, and I'm going to quote again, that UBC as a public institution is a recognized leader in taking action to combat climate change and has a mandate to effect change beyond our institutional borders, with a fundamental responsibility to advance a sustainable and just society across British Columbia, Canada, and the world. So I've begun this talk by highlighting the climate emergency and UBC's declared commitment to respond to it as a way of setting the stage for thinking about how the wide array of stakeholders in sport and sport hosting, including those at and around UBC, might respond to one of the most pressing issues of our time. When I say stakeholders here, I'm referring not only to sport managers or those concerned with sport-related issues like researchers, activists, or some government officials, but also to any citizen who's impacted by sport hosting, and recognizing that, like it or not, that means pretty much all of us. And when I say one of the most pressing issues of our time, I'm referring to the IPCC's assessment that global warming must be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels if we're to avoid some of the more catastrophic impacts of climate change, and that to achieve this, immediate action and far-reaching transformations are necessary. So that's my first answer to why now and why here. There's some other important, if a little less urgent and momentous reasons that we're holding this event today as well. The year 2020 marks the 10th anniversary of the Vancouver and Whistler Olympic and Paralympic Games. And for many, this anniversary is a moment for reflection on the legacies of the event, including memories of great experiences of various kinds, athletic successes, transformations in and around Vancouver, including here at UBC, as well as memories of struggles, tensions, and problems related to the Games. I think with our lineup of excellent panelists today, I have no doubt that some discussion of the legacy of these Games will be in the mix. And just as this is the 10th anniversary of the Vancouver and Whistler Games, this year also marks the 10th anniversary of the launch of the Center for Sport and Sustainability. The center, which as Rob mentioned in the introduction there, which is based in the School of Kinesiology here at UBC, was initiated and founded by the former director of the school, Robert Sparks, in the lead up to the Vancouver and Whistler Games, with an explicit aim of engaging with the kinds of questions that we'll be engaging this evening. Questions concerning, on one hand, how such events can be enabling for many, leverage for good, and on the other hand, questions about who benefits most and least from such events, about how decisions are made about how to carry out events, and who has most say on key matters. And of course, questions about the environmental issues related to such events, recognizing that the environmental record for host cities of many sport events is mixed. And in fact, the first and perhaps most notable activity that was carried out through the Centre for Sport and Sustainability was the Olympic Games Impact Study, or OGIE as it's known for short, that focused precisely on the range of impacts and legacies of the Vancouver and Whistler Games. And it's no coincidence that the leader of the OGIE study, and I'm pointing to the set right here, Rob Van Weinsberg, is on our panel, as is Caitlin Pendefellow-Gutt, who was involved in that study as well, and they're both panelists this evening. So again, I suspect that reflections on that study will be part of our discussion. I'll also acknowledge Matt Dolph, who I'll be introducing later on, along with the rest of the panel, who was the first graduate researcher and administrator for the Centre for Sport and Sustainability. And it's his early organizational and communication work that really formed the foundation for, I think, so many of the things we've done subsequently. And of course, Robert Sparks, who couldn't make it tonight, deserves recognition as the founder and first director of the CSS. There would be no CSS if it were not for Bob Sparks. So since these earlier days of the CSS, a range of other projects and events have taken us in a variety of directions, including around event hosting. For example, and since the renewal of the CSS in 2017, we've hosted panels on topics like athlete activism, on reconciliation, Indigenous resurgence in sport. We've also hosted a couple of film showings. One of these films was created with support from the CSS and the School of Kinesiology, and was based on the PhD research of former UBC kinesiology student and CSS affiliate Liv Yoon, that explored the environmental issues in sport mega events through a focus on the highly controversial decision to destroy an ancient forest to build a ski facility for the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics in South Korea. That film, entitled Mount Kaliwang, an Olympic Casualty, has been available for free since 2019 on the CSS website, along with a short study guide. I know it has been used in a variety of classrooms around the country and in different places in the world, actually. Last fall, the CSS hosted another event related to today's panel discussion that was simply called Climate Comeback. That event also featured a panel discussion to accompany the release of a short film. This one developed through UBC's Climate Hub, and by the Hub's lead and the idea leader for the film, person that Rob mentioned earlier, Grace Nozak. The film, which resonates well, I think, with the theme of today's events, featured interviews with athletes at or around UBC who told stories about a setback that they had experienced in and around sport and how they successfully came back from this. And these stories were aligned with concerns about the climate emergency and were intended to inspire hope and action on our current need to come back when it comes to climate change and to make the necessary societal transformations in a timely manner and to know that it is possible and doable. Again, hope was key to that piece. I highlight the topic of these two films because I think they represent the dual emphasis that's needed to take on some of the environmental issues that are at the core of the discussion today. So that's an emphasis then, on one hand, on trying to better understand in a balanced and informed fashion ways that sport event hosting can be beneficial, as well as the problems with some form of hosting, all the while remaining open to the role that sport can play in positive social change, to the ways that the hope and drive that's needed to respond to issues like climate change might be seen in and around sport, and also some of the practical ways we might look to mitigate sport event impacts and assess such impacts, and weather events, the ways that they are feasible and when they are not feasible. So we have a panel today that can speak to this range, and our hope is that this event inspires some discussion around the complexities of these issues and hopefully some ways forward too. So at this point then, I'm going to shift to offering up a few important thank yous to those who've been integral to the organization of this event, and then we'll move on to the main event where I'll introduce the panel one by one, and they will say a little bit about their work and reflect on our first presentation that we'll have. So a first thank you goes to, and I think they're sitting in the back, 5 UBC undergraduate students who've supported the organization of this event. So Phoebe Audio, who is on the panel today, Shudan Shu, Rachel Chan, Demara Featherstone, and Hannah Sarchuk. Would I embarrass you and put your hands up so we can see who you are? Thank you. So these students are all part of UBC Sustainability's flagship Sustainability Ambassadors Program, which is a year-long program for students interested in enhancing leadership and community engagement skills that will aid them in sustainability work now and into the future. This year, the CSS partnered with the program with the aim of offering some support to ambassadors interested in sport especially. So these 5 students are part of the first cohort of those we're calling the Sport and Sustainability Ambassador Designation Group. And while I hope we've offered something useful to support this group through our meetings over the year, certainly we're grateful to the ambassadors' support for this event, the work they've been doing in the lead up, and we have some activities after too. So it's in this vein that I'll acknowledge the outstanding work also of Jesse Kutcher, I know is here as well, there he is, who's the Research and Information Coordinator with the Center for Sport and Sustainability, who is integral also to the development of the CSS side of the Ambassadors Program and working with our excellent ambassadors, and of course for the leadership he's shown over the year and his broader role with the CSS. Thanks also to Chomta Hunter, the coordinator of the Sustainability Ambassadors Program, for being open to working with us. It's been wonderful working with Chomta and learning more about the program that she's led and assembled over time too. Thanks to Tim Herron. Tim manages the Center for Interactive Research and Sustainability, so this building where we are right now, and he's been a supporter of the CSS for a number of events now. So we're really grateful for the relationship we have with Tim. It's been wonderful working with him. He was generously helped both secure this facility and help us make decisions around the nuances of setting up this event. So thanks so much, Tim. Thanks also to Kate Costello, Manager of Communications and Public Relations and Kinesiology, and the communications team with Kin. Your support's been invaluable in terms of all things promotion and communication too, and we really appreciate that. Rob Buchel, Director of the School of Kinesiology, also a member of the CSS leadership team. Without Rob's support and encouragement and his commitment to taking leadership of sustainability-related work, both as part of the Center for Sport and Sustainability and within the School of Kinesiology, we wouldn't be mounting an event like this one. So we're grateful again to Rob for his commitment and vision too. And finally, and Rob thanked Andrea Bunden, but I'm going to even emphasize that more. I mean, this event does not happen without Andrea's commitment too. She's of course a professor in the School of Kinesiology, a member of the CSS leadership team. She successfully got the grant that not only is helping this event, but will help subsequent events too. So I'll do a small thank you to Shirk as well, because they're going to be helping along the way. So anyway, thank you to all of you. So now we're on to the main event. And here's how this is going to work. So we have our team of 5 panelists. We're going to begin though, and I'll be introducing people one by one, and they'll say a little bit, and then we'll move to the broader discussion. I'm going to begin by introducing Matt Dolph, who will be our first speaker. Now, Matt gets a little bit of extra time to speak this evening, as we've asked him as a way of getting us thinking about event impacts and ways that sport managers might practically engage with concerns around environmental impacts, to do a short presentation about a tool he developed called the Sport Event Carbon Footprint Estimator Tool, a tool to help managers assess the impacts of events or possible events, with the idea that one might visit this tool and then make a decision possibly to not hold an event. Maybe. That might be part of the discussion that we have. The idea is for this tool to be featured on the CSS website for use by sport event managers. So in this way, this evening's panel is part of, I guess, what we've been thinking about in discussions with Matt about exploring the utility of the tool, any issues to consider when using a tool like this, all information that we plan to post with the tool so as to offer appropriate context for, I guess you could say, responsible use amongst those who would come to the tool. So what I'll do is begin by introducing Matt, and then I will one by one introduce our panelists, and they will begin by spending a few minutes talking both about themselves and their positioning in relation to the topic of the day, and then maybe responding a little bit to, either directly or indirectly, to Matt's presentation. So here we go. I'm going to begin with Matt. So our first panelist is Matt Dolph. Matt's current position here at UBC is Director of the Wellbeing Initiative, a role that itself is relevant to climate change as he works to bridge health and sustainability sectors. Matt's PhD research, which he completed through the School of Kinesiology at UBC, was based around an assessment of environmental performance of sport events run at UBC using life cycle assessment methods. Matt has long been a passionate researcher and advocate of deepening our understanding of sport as a vehicle for positive change. He's co-creator of the Sport and Sustainability Event Toolkit, which was the first sustainability management guidance document for sport events, and it was used by the International Olympic Committee, Vancouver 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So I'll back off and pass it over to Matt.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Thanks everyone, Rob and everybody else for inviting me. This has been a lot of fun to be able to come and dust off some of my old PhD work. It's actually giving me defense flashbacks right now. Pulling in some of the same slides and talking to a room full of people about this. So I thought I would start by giving a little bit of context around some of the work that I did as part of my PhD to measure the environmental impacts of events. Talk a little bit about what led me to do that work and some of what's going on around measuring environmental impacts of events, give you a little bit of theory, and then we'll dive into a tool that I developed to measure the carbon footprint of travel. So I'll spend about 15 minutes or so just walking through that and showing the tool, and then we'll do a little live demo of the results from when you checked in at the registration desk to see how we're doing with the tool. So I've got up on the slide here a quote that's often used from Jacques Rogge, former IOC president, that talks about the importance of legacy to the Olympic movement. I've seen this quote in many places, and I think the idea here is that Olympic Games often frame a lot of their work and commitments around the idea that they could leverage positive change and build a better world. So that'll be a topic of conversation for today. So there's actually been some scholarship that's developed over the last number of years. Brian's alluded to some of the work that's happened here at UBC at the CSS. And I'll just give a couple highlights around what guided my work in this field. Ever since probably Albertville in 1992, the Winter Olympic Games, and then Lillehammer in 1994, there has been a rise of a sort of green consciousness around the Olympic Games. The idea that we could plan Olympic Games with more of an environmental focus in mind. The Olympic movement has the environment as a pillar, and so it started to really frame up the agenda. It's also no accident that actually, I'll come to that in a second. The Prime Minister of Norway at the time when the Lillehammer Games happened was Gro Harlem Brundtland, who came up with the definition for sustainability that everybody uses. Other researchers have talked about sort of the unique ability for events to engender a sense of community, which then might be able to be leveraged for social change. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more as some of our panelists. I think you all know as well the visibility and outreach of some events can be enormous around the world, and there's something about this, capturing the world's attention or a country's attention in a short moment of time that can lead to significant outreach and visibility. So the question is, can you harness that? And especially around mega events, there's been some literature that's asked, could you actually leverage some of this into positive economic, social, environmental change? Part of the reason that I came into doing this PhD was I'd spent about a decade before coming back to university working in the sport movement, trying to understand at the time what sustainability meant in the sports sector, what carbon footprinting was all about. We were still trying to decide what those terms even meant in the early days, and working with IOC and other federations to help them manage events more sustainably. But we really didn't have a good sense of how you measure environmental impacts and how that actually informed decisions. So there I would still say isn't a strong understanding of environmental impacts to guide decision making. Most events don't use quantitative environmental impact assessment in planning events. It's pretty resource intensive and takes some knowledge. And lots more can be done around both theory and methods to develop how you measure environmental, social, economic impacts. So I decided to look at the environmental impacts when I came to do my PhD and just think about how that would better inform planners to make some decisions. So I just thought I'd give you a fun example of why this can be important. So just going to do a quick poll here. If you compare my commute into UBC by car, by myself from Olympic Village, versus how many coffee cups that would be in terms of the coffee itself and the footprint of the cups, how many do you think that would be?
11.
11 cups. Okay. One more guess. More. 200. Ooh, that's very close. Well, you're halfway there. So yeah, the equivalent for my commute is about 500 plus cups of coffee. But that is only the cup of coffee itself. That's not saying sort of like disposable cup of coffee versus reusable mug. If you're just looking at the relative benefit of disposable, which is actually not very big, you'd have to rewash a cup maybe 200 times before you saw an actual benefit to using it over buying disposable. You'd be talking thousands and thousands. So one of the things that I keep saying is we tend to focus a lot on waste and recycling, when really, if one person didn't commute from home, that would be much more than all of the cups of coffee combined. So getting just a relative sense of impacts really helps you know where you should focus and how you should guide decisions. So the word sustainability or sustainable development is used a lot. I mean, it's a requirement now for all Olympic Games. I'm talking mostly about Olympic Games right now, but this applies to many, many sport events around the world, including FIFA and others. But I think what's important to understand is that how we understand that term actually varies significantly. So this is a picture of Sochi. They had significant commitments around sustainability, green buildings, having waste management plans. But you have to question whether or not it was sustainable when they had massive deforestation issues. They built everything from scratch, probably not well used anymore, and massive travel footprint. So what do we actually mean when we say we're planning an event sustainably? I'm going to do a tiny bit of theory. I promise I won't go too deep in this, but I think it's interesting. It opened my eyes when I thought about it in this way. Sustainability can mean many things. So you can first, Drizek does a good job of breaking things into kind of two broad camps, survivalists, Prometheans. Prometheans come from the perspective of technology will fix all. Let's not fuss, human innovation will sort things out, we're fine. Survivalists take more of an approach around recognizing we have limited carrying capacity, we have a planet with limited resources, we need to think about those constraints to growth. But even within that, there are big differences in how that can look when you plan an event. So two theories that have been used somewhat in the event movement have been ecological modernization theory, which would say more or less business as usual is fine if we just start to green things a little bit more, account for some of the environmental considerations as part of business as usual. And a little bit further, on the other end of the spectrum, regenerative design theory is something that says, no, let's actually put humans and nature at the same equal footing. So ecological modernizationists would say human trumps environment, the other one puts them more at the same footing, and would also say we're in a state of overshoot, let's aim for net positive change. This building is an example actually of a project that aimed for net positive change. So outcomes are very different when you plan from let's be a bit more efficient versus let's actually aim for net change. So when you're talking about sustainability, it's important to understand there's different poles of understanding about that. And one last slide to support that. So over the decades, we've seen a decoupling of GDP growth with material use. So that's positive. You can actually grow economically more than using resources, but we haven't come close to bending the curve down to say we can grow and reduce resources at the same time. So I'd argue we need much more drastic decoupling of that to even have a chance of getting back towards sustainability. So how do you measure things like that? I used a tool called life cycle assessment. I won't get into the guts of the methodology too much. Just a couple quick considerations. It's one of the more reliable tools for detailed impacts, and you can use it very well to compare results between events or between two types of impact, like coffee cup and car. There's many types of environmental impacts. We'll focus on climate change today, and it's the one most used in the event sector. But it does rely on significant data collection and planning and a lot of methodological considerations, which I'll talk about in a minute when I show my tool. And what my tool focuses on is this idea, it doesn't have to be perfect. A rough estimate is enough to inform initial planning and thinking. And I love this quote by George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And if we can just find something useful to plan, that'll help. Okay, so another quick example of what I mean by this idea of is it useful? So which one do you think has the higher impact between the two here, tap water or bottled water? Now you're nervous about guessing, yeah? Bottled water. Do you think they're relatively close or significantly different?
I guess it comes where is the bottled water coming from, but I suspect significantly less.
Yeah. So about 2,000 times worse. So in this case, it's a massive difference. So that's helpful. Now we can really know for sure, let's promote tap water wherever we can. Okay, so I'll just give you spend another minute quickly on some of the results of the 2 case studies that I did as part of my PhD. One was on athletics and recreation here at UBC, looking at our teams and venues over 1 season of competition. And what I found in terms of carbon footprint was about 8,000 tons of CO2e for the whole season of activities. Over 70% of that came from venues. That's partly because UBC owns and builds and operates its own venues over the year, which is different from another event that might just come for a couple days. And then travel 24%, and everything put together a couple percent. So we can say, all right, let's focus on travel and venues, CAVI, when we're starting to reduce the footprint. I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit. We did a ranking of venues to know where to focus, and short story here is focus on energy primarily. The more energy the venues use, the more footprint it'll have. Began to tease out how you measure the carbon footprint of travel, and realized pretty quickly that the long distance travel by car and plane is really the biggest area of focus, and I'll come back to that idea in a moment. I did a second case study on another event that UBC hosted, which was the Special Olympics Canada Summer Games that we had in 2014. I had to include this picture of CAVI on a blender bike. We had a sustainability plan that wove throughout the event, and this was the sustainability station at the athletes hangout area as part of the event. So it's a human-powered smoothie. And so we had lots of activation around It was good, yeah. It was a very hot day, actually. So we had lots of planning and activation around sustainability, but also measured the carbon footprint of the event. This was different in that it was a one-time event that happened for 4 days, and it borrowed all of the same venues for about a 4 or 5 day time period. It was a couple thousand athletes that came. And the footprint there was about 2,500 tons of CO2e. But the pattern was really different. Travel was by far the biggest. You can see the column on the left is the travel to the event, then accommodation, food, venue, communications. Travel at is the sort of travel between venues or on the days. And then finally waste is that tiny little speck at the bottom. So I used my methodology for this, and I'm getting to the tool here in a second, to design the tool because there are quite a few methodological decisions you have to make in how you do this. And one of the things we quickly realized by looking at the patterns was you can group things pretty easily, and did it in this case by, you can't actually read, but each column represents a geographic area. So rather than worrying about the exact travel distance each person makes, we just said, good enough if you say, are people coming from the city, from the region, from the province, or out of province? And you can see that just by looking at colors, they cluster pretty well. And that's good enough to estimate impact. And you also still get some surprises. Like this, people came from across the country. What you're seeing in purple, top right, is more or less Toronto average in terms of distance. And blue is how many people drove from Toronto. None of us actually anticipated that. We were thinking everybody would fly. But to see how many people actually drove is an example of how it helped inform some of the assumptions we made around travel patterns. Okay, so long story short, out of 2 case studies, it was pretty clear that travel was one of the biggest contributors, venues. Food overall is one of the biggest contributors to global warming, so that's something that events can certainly think about and leverage, and then accommodation as well. The others are important to think about, but don't have as much of an impact, so they were under 5% for both. So I'm now going to shift over to my tool. After doing this, one of the things that I realized was events don't have the internal capacity to hire professional life cycle assessment people, to pay tens of thousands of dollars for these really expensive tools and databases that you need to actually do this software, to run these numbers. And it takes a lot of time to collect that data, analyze the data, make decisions. As we can talk about a bit later, there's very little in terms of guidance for how you do this in a fair way. We all have accounting principles we have to follow. We don't have them for carbon footprinting. So it's a bit of a Wild West still. So I thought it'd be useful to share a public tool on just the travel footprint piece. I'm working on the other components later. And that's what we're sharing tonight, is I finally polished up this tool that everybody can go and use when it's up on the website. And I'll just take, Andrew, how am I doing for time, Andrew? The last few minutes to kind of walk through it. just general nod, okay. All right, tell me to speed up if you want me to. Okay, so I'm going to open the tool. And somehow it's become smaller, so let me zoom in a little bit more. You don't have to read this, but I'll just walk through very high level what the tool is all about. So it's called a Sport Event Carbon Footprint Estimator with a focus on travel, and as the other areas emerge, I'll probably roll them all up into one tool. The idea here is that I chose the word estimator carefully. It's not about communicating publicly your exact footprint or saying, look, this event is better than that event. There are just too many considerations at play to really go that far. It's about making it a useful planning tool. So you have a sense of what should we focus on. And if we did this versus that, how much might that save? So it really is what we call kind of hot spotting, or back of the envelope, getting a sense of what's important so you know what to focus on. There's some sort of context and caveats here, but the tool is built around two different ways of calculating things. One is called the simple estimator. So what we can do, and we can just do this live, this is your travel footprint, and you can update you can't see the colors too well here, but you can update these fields in white and say, for the number of people attending an event, just put the number that you think from city, region, province, or out of province. So why don't we just do that quickly right now together? How many of you came here from the city or live in the city? Raise your hands. Okay, basically, actually I'll do it the other way. I'll just say the rest are from the city. Anybody come here from outside of Vancouver? So I'm talking Burnaby, Surrey, Coquitlam, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll put 7. How about outside Metro Vancouver, so further than, like, say, Langley? Nobody, okay. 1. Where did you come from, Caitlin? Ottawa, okay, well, that'll be the next box. I saw 1 over there, okay. And then out of province, 1. And I'll just guess we're around 50.
I came from Ottawa on Sunday, so I don't know if you want to double up those numbers.
Yeah, but no, that'll kill our numbers if we do that. Okay, so that gives you a quick sense of rough kilometers and then rough footprint. On the right, you can toggle between kilos or tons. Kilos probably makes more sense in this case. It's a small number. And then you can see the table updates automatically. And Caitlin has basically obliterated the field here. Yeah, so it would have been double that if Rob was here, but since Rob, you just saved us about 1 ton of CO2, so that was great. Which would have been as much as everything else put together. So you can see what the difference of one person flying actually makes.
Matt, we have one person from Norway.
Who's come explicitly for this event?
No.
Okay. That's the key question. All right. So one of the things that was really important for me when I designed this tool is you can find lots of carbon footprint tools online, but was to not make it a black box. What I mean by that is to make it really obvious what the assumptions are and how it was designed and referenced. So if you click on the Assumptions tab next to it, now you can see how I actually arrived at those numbers, and you can adjust them. So I'm assuming, and this is something that we learned from a lot of events, typically there's 2.7 people per car for events. So that's an assumption I made, but if it's a typical commuting scenario, it would be more like 1.1 people per car. So we could adjust that if we think that's more realistic, and you can change the occupancy rate for each mode type. You can also change the assumed distances. So I'm just assuming kind of center of Vancouver to UBC in this case for the city, and for out of province, I'm assuming Toronto, which worked pretty well because Ottawa is pretty close to Toronto, but you could say Calgary's more realistic, so I'm going to change this and make it like 2,000 kilometers. So it's easy to see how the assumptions have been made, and then the yellow box gives you some simple numbers that tell you what other common metrics are that you could use. So if you forget to, you can refer back to what's in the pop-up box. And then you can change the mode split. So again, this is within the city. It's assuming 10% of people bike, 40% of people car. This is taking kind of average transportation averages that are robust for a large number of people, but you can easily go in and tweak these. So if you change any of these numbers, like I just changed car to 1.1, and then you go back over, you'll see that the number would have changed somewhat. So it's simple, but also you can go in and start to play with some of the parameters. The other thing we can do, and now this is a bit of a comparison for the numbers we captured for this event, you can go and capture actual data. So I'll zoom in here. If you're actually able to, on an event registration form, or as we did today, as you came in, you just gave your information, you can capture for person-by-person data. And so as you were coming in, we asked you what region you came from, what mode you chose, roughly what distance you came from, and then the occupancy rate if you're in a car. And I've also added a column here to work out if you're staff, spectator, or visitor or other, because often patterns are really different. Athletes would often travel much further, for example, than spectators. That might be mostly local, so it's a helpful way to divide up. And then once you've filled out all the data, then you can go and see the report card here. Sorry, I keep zooming out. And so it tells me that 31 of you registered as coming to this event, total distance of 600 kilometers, 20 average, and about 1.25, about 100 kilos of CO2 total. So, yes? Yeah, great question. So if you drove an electric car, so this takes average vehicles. Looking at all the vehicles on the road, it takes an average. And the coffee cup example I gave you was an average car. I drive electric too. It would have been way different. But it's a great example of how a decision like that, do you want to choose actual car or average, will enormously change the numbers. And I would argue you need to have standardized rules for that kind of thing. Otherwise, everybody can make their own decisions and numbers are completely out of whack. So one of the things I argue for is that we have standardized protocols for how you make those kinds of decisions. And then it gives you a few graphs here so you can see how many people came by car and by participant type. You can see the carbon footprint and then the actual data if you want to copy it. And then travel distance and frequency by region. So that's the tool. You can also go to the last tab here and see, there's no point zooming in, it's just a list of references that you can go and chase down how we arrived at those assumptions, some of the source journal articles, and then some of the acronyms that are used. So again, it's important that this is totally transparent, and then something that hopefully others can contribute to, especially students or grad students. If you want to work on this and keep building it out, that would be great. And then the last thing I just want to say is a sneak peek of a tool that's in development, which if any students are here and want to help me with, that would be great. I've got a tool that I'm almost there on, which will measure the overall carbon footprint for multiple areas, not just travel. So that is this one. So this one takes the travel estimator I showed you and then does the same thing for food, for accommodations, for waste, and then you can roll up and compare the differences. So that will make it really easy to compare some of those other areas, but it needs another bit of time and work to fill out the protocols. So that's my summary, and I'm looking forward to the presentation of discussion with some of my colleagues. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. So hold your questions for Matt. I'm looking at the clock. I don't know how much time we'll have at the end for broader questions, but we'll see. But hold your questions for then, or at the very least, there'll be some time after as well. So in the sake of time, then we're going to move on to our next panelist, the opening that they'll offer, and that is Kavi Tour. So Kavi is Senior Director at UBC in Facilities, Recreation, Sport Partnerships, and Business Development. That's a conglomeration of the portfolio, and has been responsible for leading major capital projects at UBC, including legacy projects like the UBC Aquatic Center, UBC Thunderbird Park, Doug Mitchell Thunderbird Sports Center, and many others. He also played a lead role. We talked about the 10-year anniversary. Kavi played a lead role around that too, around the hosting of the Olympic and Paralympic Games, as well as the UBC Olympic Legacy Strategy. So I'll pass it over to Kavi.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks everyone for having me today. Just a couple of words. The reason I'm raspy is that I've attended 3 sport events in the last weekend, so you don't have to worry about fist bumping me later. I'm okay. It was for our basketball championships in Ottawa, and then the rugby sevens. Anyone else go to rugby sevens? No. So the reason I mentioned those events is talking a bit about the impact beyond UBC. So Rugby Sevens is hosted by a group called Sport Hosting Vancouver, and it's a part that UBC is a part of, and it's a group that looks to attract different events to come to the region. So sometimes at UBC we've hosted events like a Davis Cup, figure skating championships, and also the group that is bringing together the Women's World Cup, Rugby Sevens, World Junior Hockey Championships. So the reason I say that is this is where the work that we do on campus starts to impact in a broader lens. So a lot of Matt's initial work has sparked our group in thinking about event impacts on a larger scale and how to assess them. So typically before, a lot of the work the work that UBC has brought to the discussion has been really focused in around the economic impact. So what are the dollars generated from a major event as being the primary indicator. Now I think the analysis is being rounded out a bit, including the environmental impact, including a community impact. Now we're still developing what the right appropriate tool would be, but just the fact that we're having the conversation around that broader impact is really important. And of course, it also leads to very interesting questions around dichotomies of major events. So the major events, a success metric for my colleagues in tourism or the Hotel Association is people who are out of region because they're staying nights in hotels and we're going out to restaurants and bars, whereas that has a dichotomy against a certain environmental impact. So it's interesting having these conversations at that level, but I wanted to share that story around the broader impact that this type of work has done in terms of a more regional project. I'll also make mention that Matt's work really helped guide our decision making, especially around venues. So subsequent to that work, we now have an embedded energy manager in our portfolio and typically spend the neighborhood of 500 to 700,000 per year on sustainably focused projects. So this is really on recognizing when you look at that, you're like, you should really focus a lot of your efforts on venues, whereas we were pretty spread out in terms of how we're focusing our sustainability efforts. So that allowed a lot of focus, and we're at the point where we've actually had a net carbon reduction over the last few years as a result of some of the sustainability measures that we've undertaken. Some of those are results of newer facilities versus older facilities. A new aquatic center is much better than the old aquatic center, of course, but there's other really great embedded stories. So I think I'll leave it at that, and then I look forward to other questions on the panel.
Okay, our next panelist, Caitlin, is Caitlin Petitfellow-Gad, and Caitlin's principal of Halcyon Sport and Event Consulting, also a PhD graduate from the School of Kinesiology at UBC, and fairly recently became a postdoctoral fellow also through the Center for Sport and Sustainability in Kinesiology. Caitlin's worked across a variety of sectors, from sport, research, and academic sectors. She was a director at Via Sport BC, a legacy organization of the 2010 Games, oversaw $15 million of the province's investment into amateur sport while leading the innovation, research, and granting teams. She's received grant-based funding from the IOC and FIFA, has been a research team studying the 2010 Winter Olympics, 2015 FIFA Women's World Cup, 2018 Grey Cup, and currently the 2020 IIHF Women's World Ice Hockey Championships too. So with that background, I'll pass it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Brian. I should have left more for me to say. But just some introductory fun fact I just realized in thinking about the anniversary of the 2010 Games, that 10 years ago, I first stepped foot on UBC's campus as a volunteer. And at that time, I had never been to Vancouver and never been west of Niagara Falls. Wound up going to a game to watch the US and China play over at Thunderbird Arena. And now 10 years later, I accidentally stayed, did a PhD, and now a postdoc here and lived here for a number of years. So it's lovely to be back and to think about all those memories post-2010 and the road to get here. As Brian said, my PhD research focused a lot on the impacts of the 2010 Winter Olympic Games from both a social housing and homelessness policy perspective. So focusing in 2 areas, so Southeast Falls Creek, the Olympic Village, and also the downtown east side. So the 2010 Games were really meant to be this landmark and groundbreaking, super inclusive event to really protect one of Vancouver's most marginalized populations in the downtown east side. The way that was achieved was through a number of statements and commitments around the inner city and how that would how that would take shape. Secondary to that would be social housing, so big commitments, big promises made in Falls Creek. Really threw me off for a second. But really, I know we've got a lot more time today, but spoiler alert, neither of those things happened. But it took me 5 years and a PhD to tell you that. During that time, I was really fortunate to work with Rob on the Olympic Games Impact Study. Rob over on the computer there was also my advisor. And that really looked at the Games from the lens of sociocultural, environmental, and economic impact. And this study pioneered a lot of, I would say, groundbreaking techniques around attribution and assessment that have in many ways shaped and formed the way that the IOC currently reports on particularly the sociocultural aspect of these assessments. After PhD, I knew I wanted to go out in the sector, so shout out to my VIA Sport friends who I see in the corner, who I had the pleasure to work with while I was a rector at VIA Sport. But that was really a great time for this really hands-on approach in terms of what does legacy mean, how do we conceptualize that, how do we evaluate that. So the red thread for me throughout my career has been the impact of sport on society. Who's quantifying it? Who measures that? Why does it matter? And why do we care? And so that's been the approach that I've brought to my consulting in recent days, working on a range of events, but really that evaluation of, why does this matter? Who decides that it matters? And why? Are really those questions that have continued to drive both my academic research and my consulting practice. Thanks.
All right, and our next panelist is Phoebe Audio, who I mentioned earlier. So Phoebe is a third-year UBC student pursuing a Bachelor and Master of Management dual degree through Sauder School of Business, as well as a major in Geography with a focus on environment and sustainability. As a former competitive athlete and current member of the UBC Sustainability Ambassador Program, she hopes to lend her experiences and voice to any cause that explores the intersections of sport and sustainability. And I can say, having met Phoebe well before actually she was an ambassador, when she came to chat with me about these kinds of things, I learned a lot about sort of Phoebe's passion for these kinds of issues. And I think we're really fortunate to have someone as thoughtful and passionate about these topics, along with her colleagues in the Ambassadors Program, sort of leading us now and into the future. So with that, I'll pass it on.
So, let's see, a little shorter here. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I see quite a few familiar faces in the crowd, as well as so many new ones. So it's really exciting to see so much passion and mobilization around this issue. Like Brian mentioned, my name is Phoebe. I'm a third-year student studying geography, environment sustainability, as well as business as part of a dual degree program. So my passions kind of lie in these intersections around business and using business to do good. So like Brian also mentioned, I'm a sustainability ambassador and part of a new cohort this year called Sport and Sustainability, run through the Center for Sport and Sustainability. We've had Ryan and Jesse as our wonderful mentors this year, and have also got to cross paths with Matt in December, and that was really awesome just to see the amazing work he's been doing. I'll speak a little bit about the ambassadorship program just to raise a little bit of awareness about what we do, and then I'll go into my background and kind of why I'm here, I guess. So the Sustainability Ambassador Program is a cohort of about 25 to 30 students every year who work during the school year on student engagement at UBC with environmental issues. We kind of break up into smaller working groups that target more niche projects. And my 4 other group mates and I, like I mentioned, worked on sport and sustainability. We were kind of brand new, and so it was a little bit daunting trying to delve into what we were going to do. But we had wonderful mentors, and after visiting with Matt in December, kind of changed our trajectory in research away from kind of consumption patterns and travel of the UBC sports program, more towards just engaging with athletes and engaging with people like yourselves who come to these amazing events. So that's my main focus of why I'm here, but I'm also here, I think, just representing a young voice in the midst of the climate emergency. I think it's important to have a broad depth of backgrounds and experiences, and also experiences that have yet to come. So my life and people of my age, our lives will be, and our experiences to come will be greatly impacted by environmental events that are we don't know what's going to happen. And then finally, I think I'm here because, like Brian mentioned, I was a competitive athlete for the majority of my life. I played ice hockey. I'm from the US and I'm from a very rural state, Montana. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. A lot of people in the US actually think it's part of Canada. So yeah, I feel right at home. The environment and geography there is very similar to, I think, like kind of middle Canada. So a lot of the traveling we do isn't necessarily measured in distance traveled, but rather hours. So it's a lot of waking up at 5 a.m. and rolling out of the car with really stiff legs and just hopping on the ice and doing the best you can. And then I was privileged enough actually to get selected to go to or attend some Olympic development camps, which then ultimately led me to play the last 3 years of my career or high school career at a boarding school in New England. And this kind of opened a lot of new windows and just perspectives to me. I hadn't really been in an environment like that before. Just really big facilities, a lot of resources, just a lot more attention and kind of commercialization of all of that. And it really made me reflect on kind of the sports industry as a whole. Unfortunately, I don't really play competitive sports anymore. I had a lot of injuries and just thought it'd be best to come back west and pursue kind of my passions and environmental issues, which I developed a passion for in high school. And so now but it will always remain kind of like a part of my identity and definitely a really big community for me and just something that I'm always looking to improve and use as a tool for positive change. So yeah, that's a little quick introduction to me, and I look forward to any questions that come my way and to my fellow panelists. So thank you all.
Great, thanks so much, Phoebe. And finally, Rob Van Weinsberg, who's kindly agreed to either get up really early or stay up really late, I'm not sure which, to join us from the UK. So Rob's a professor in the Department of Educational Studies here at UBC. His research is focused on sustainability and the impacts of sport mega events has been a real focus of his over time. As I mentioned earlier, Rob was the lead researcher on the Olympic Games impact study, the very first Olympic Games impact study commissioned by the IOC. And he was a key representative of the Center for Sport and Sustainability right from the outset. So I'll pass it over to Rob to say a few words too.
Thank you very much, Brian. I hope everyone can hear me. I just have a couple of introductory remarks, actually, based on Matt's presentation, which I really enjoyed. The one idea that I think is important to think about is this idea that perhaps sustainability itself is a social movement, a global social movement. And I'm really interested in that in part because I think that opens up the door to talking about sport as a social institution, which I think it's an important conversation to have. And I'd like to kind of detail that as we keep moving through. But I feel like the time is right for us to consider sport and what sport has become and therefore what it means in terms of sustainability. And I don't think that conversation has happened to the degree that it needs to. We automatically think of something like elite amateur or professional ranks when we think about sport, and that leads to us having these fairly large impacts. And when I looked at the calculator, I was really struck by the fact that everything that is heavily extractive has to do with people. So we have travel and we have food in Matt's work, and then in larger mega events, we tend to think about venues. All of these are about people getting there, people eating, and people sitting and watching. And I think if we can kind of think through a little bit about what sport actually is, what sport could be to serve more people in the ways that it can function and can provide, then I think we can maybe peel back some of the major assumptions that go into these big events. And I look forward to that conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a few questions prepared, and what I'll do is just begin by asking the panel, and I'll point to one or two individuals to start, and we'll move this around as we move through some of the questions, and there will be hopefully a little bit of time at the end. We'll open this up as well. So again, just with, I guess, with Matt's tool as a backdrop to this. So the tool that Matt presented is obviously designed to support the work of sport managers interested in holding more environmentally friendly sport events. So, Kavi, you've talked a little bit about the work you've already been involved in, but would you mind just commenting maybe a little more generally on the role that you think sport managers should be playing as part of the response to environmental concerns and the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to ask. I think it's probably the framing of it is really key from my observation, not that it's part of the very initial discussion around the why are we doing an event and what are the sort of positive impacts, what are the negative impacts. So I think the conversation has shifted, I think, from being an afterthought perhaps, or being part of the later conversations to now being right at the outset. So I think that's the major paradigm shift that's occurred from my perspective. I think it's becoming more and more pervasive in the sport industry as well, whereas I think sport's been, in some areas, been ahead, but in a lot of areas still been a little bit behind. Whereas at conferences and industry events, this is becoming a regular topic, a regular conference subject, and more people are engaging. Whereas if I was attending a sport conference 10 years ago, a sustainability topic would have very, very sparse attendance. Now I think people are realizing this is a priority. So there's been a bit of a shift there for sure.
Great, thanks. Could I do a quick follow-up on that? I remember a few years ago you presented in this building and on the work that you're doing. And I remember you talked about how in order to do something that was more environmentally friendly with facilities here, you needed to make a business case as the lead on this. I'm wondering if that has changed at all.
Yeah, no, it's very much still the case. I think when we look at our capital projects or even sustainable renovations that allow us to reduce our carbon impact, we look at sort of having two check marks, a sustainability check mark and a business check mark. Of course, there's lots of behavior change elements below them, but that's really around how we guide our decision making. I'd say we've shifted now, whereas percentages have changed. Previously, we would be in this scenario where you really had to make business sense, and as like an 80% indicator and 20% sustainability success. Now I think it's really, they're very even metrics. So when we're making our decision making, we're not only looking at what's the financial ROI in terms of the venue savings from the energy usage, but we're also looking at what's going to really turn the dial in terms of sustainability side of things. Again, not only just from the energy usage, but also from a behavior change. What can also start to be stories that can be shared, that people who are managing those venues, people who are managing sport programs, youth who are visiting the facilities, student athletes, that can start to experience that behavior change. So it's very much been a shifting for sure. Good question.
Great, thank you. I know that there's some other members of the panel who have some experiences with and thoughts on this. Anyone who'd like to comment? I see some nods from Matt and
Go ahead.
Caitlin.
Yeah, sure. I'll comment on that too. I recently worked with an event organizer, host organizing committee, who, half jokingly, I said they're going to say their top priorities are tickets, tickets, and tickets. And for by and large, especially for small events, domestics, or world championships, that's what they're doing. That's what they're in the business of, is selling tickets. So anything that falls outside of that purview it's a big ask for them. So what I love so much about the tool that you created, Matt, is that while you have a PhD, you don't need a PhD to do it.
Right.
And that any organizer with an eye on ticket sales would be able to use and apply that, because really to put evaluation tools in the hands of those that are going to use them, of those who can actually make intelligible and actionable decisions based on that information, that's where change really comes from. So equipping decision makers with the tools and capacity to do that is definitely the very first step. So even those, very simple cutaways of like, this is who flew here, it's me. I feel bad now. But that is a very, very good heuristic of what those impacts are and how we conceptualize them. And I think that logic extends all the way up. So if you ask that same question to the IOC, and I did ask them this a couple of years ago, what are the top things to you? They said, we care that the event is delivered on time, and we care that the event is secure. Other than that, it's in the hands of the host organizing committee. So there's tons of ideas around what that kind of sustainable management should look like, but there's not a lot of great direction, and a lot of people kind of left to their own devices. So in absence of tools
that are useful and highly applicable, we're not going to see change in that area. So the more that we can get any kind of tool, no matter, I don't care if it's back of the envelope or that these are estimates or that these are aggregate measures, that's what's going to help drive the conversation forward so that we can get those tools into the hands of the decision makers is really, I think, a great contribution.
Just add to that, build on those comments. So I actually came to this work from 10 plus years in the event management. So I was wearing a manager hat for many, many years and then working with managers, IOC and others. So that's the perspective I came to with doing my research and then developing this tool. They want to know as early as possible. This is the other thing to really underline. The earlier you can have that conversation, the more potential influence you'll have on design of venue, event, opportunity to bring in sponsors, opportunity to find other ways to make meaningful changes. And I found that again and again. Have that conversation early on and then repeatedly, and then you can really inform some pretty amazing things. The other thing I just wanted to mention was, and I'm sure we'll come back to this topic in a minute, but I'm talking about relative impacts within an event, and those are important. An event should try to optimize where they can, but it's also important a little bit to what Rob was saying, to think about how you can leverage or encourage change beyond the event itself, right? So food might not be a big impact of your event, but if you can then influence a food provider or a region or bring in a SkyTrain like the Olympics was able to sort of accelerate, then there's this interesting opportunity to really influence things. And the last thing I want to say was just a shout out to Kathy, because me doing that case study was him coming in the early days to CSS going, what should we focus on in athletics? Like, you're interested in sustainability, but you weren't sure if it was recycling or what. And so just having that conversation sparked this project and many of the other outcomes that came. So getting the interest in conversation early, I think, is a big part of this.
Thank you. I'm going to do just a quick follow-up with you, Matt, as well. Because of your years working, I think, with various sport managers who've taken environmental issues seriously or perhaps not seriously, you would probably have, I would assume, some insight into both how these tools can be used and misused. Do you have any concerns about a tool like the one that you've put together, which I think clearly has a lot of benefits to it, but you're probably the best person to speak to the ways that it might be used in ways that weren't intended?
Yeah, I mentioned it's the Wild West out there because there's a few things. So one, there isn't really a standardized way to measure these things. And so typically events can just measure themselves and report out and say, look how great this is. And it's very easy to move the goalpost and decide what you count. So an example is spectator travel is typically considered not owned by the event. Most would sort of report that way. They'd say we're indirectly influencing it. Some would count it. Some might even offset it. But they wouldn't say they own those emissions. But that's still a decision that generally is made by that event. So there's some significant areas where we really need to standardize approach. Something that's really actually positive is the IOC has worked with UN and others to recently develop a brand new carbon footprint set of guidelines for events. So it's the first time that we've actually seen some recommended guidelines that I think that will have to apply to Olympics, but other events can start to use. So that will really help. That's partly why in the name, in all of the initial framing, caveat around what the use of this tool is meant to be and that it's meant to spark a conversation. I've seen so many times event organizers that want to do the right thing and then see the numbers being pretty big in something like travel and go, we don't want to talk about that because that gets at the core, like the DNA of well, we don't want people to stop flying or we don't want to, mention the bad stuff. Let's just focus on the things we can influence. That's something else I'd like to chat more about. I think that those that do actually start to make meaningful shifts will be seen well, and that's still a positive story. But those are some of the pros and cons around these tools, yeah.
Great, thank you. Now, I do have another question that has Caitlin and Phoebe as the leads on this. Rob, do you have any other thoughts on this question?
No, I'm okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, the follow-up then, so to the extent that we should be relying on sport managers to make good decisions about holding environmentally friendly sport events, what role should others be playing on this issue, and who are these others? And have Caitlin and Phoebe perhaps might have some comments.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I think identifying the others for me, or the places that I can speak from, are just players themselves and then coaches as well. But I think my view on this is that sports managers do really have a large responsibility in this, given that coaches move in and out. That's not necessarily their job. And as for players, something that's really interesting just as a community and as a culture within the sports is that so like we call it, keep that outside of the locker room. So anything that sort of takes away from the game or what you're focused on, what your main, goal is keep it outside, because we need to maintain kind of peace within the locker room, and we need to keep our eyes on the goal, which is the event. But I think there's something really, there's a really great opportunity here if change is able to come from above using tools like this. Just because the sports community in general is a very cohesive one, and so if change is made at the top, it can quickly work its way down. Just a little addition is that the U.S. women's hockey mantra is actually, we are part of something greater than ourselves, and so we go about with this mindset and this mantra within ourselves. Just when, if we have a value as a community, we will all work together to make that a reality, and I definitely see that being really useful in the climate crisis and the climate emergency. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think when we think about those, I think in the literature they're called Tier 1 events, so those FIFA, Olympic Games, World Cup style events, the power that's concentrated at the very top is very high. There's a lot going on in terms of what's going on there, but there's also a lot of other processes at work. So Rob and I back in the day looked at every bid book produced, I think, between 2000 and 2016. And really, I think what was most surprising there is that really the homogenizing effort to make all of those bid books look similar, those are pressures that those organizing committees are feeling from the IOC and from those bodies. So they're pressured to make commitments like the greenest games, the most sustainable ever, the best ever. It's not surprising that every game since 2000 has rolled out some iteration of the greenest, the best, the most sustainable. That doesn't mean that any of those things are being achieved. So in terms of that follow-up and that evaluation, that's where we have so much room to grow. Rio had in its bid book that they were going to clean the Guanabara Bay with the games. Guess what? Didn't happen. I was in Paris this summer at an event for Paris 2024 and actually took out my real-time translation earpiece when they said that they were going to clean the Seine in 4 years' time. The Seine. Medieval levels of pollution to be ready for open water swimming and triathlon. So we've, for some reason, as a society, given a lot of power to these events like the Olympic Games, and that Jacques Rogge quote is really indicative of that these are going to, bequeath all of these social, environmental, and economic benefits, and you're welcome, and it's going to be great. But the follow-up for that is so poor. And it's really only from, in Vancouver's case, and Rob's research touches on this quite a bit, but early community activist groups that were in touch with the bid from 2001 onwards, and they stayed on those claims hard. Those were the people in the community that brought that visibility forward. And so it's research that does that and continues to push the envelope to say, it's not okay for you to say, oh, we followed this ISO or this GRI protocol, check mark, it's done. That's not how it really works. So really making sure that those evaluation tools are also contextually specific and locally defined is so important in terms of setting the stage for what expectations are and accountability. And that accountability, half of that equation, has not yet caught up. So I think that comes from the stakeholders outside of the IOC, everyone outside the IOC, every level of government, be that at the kind of the federal level, the provincial, the local, and then community organizing groups, to really say that this is what we expect and this is what we're counting on for. And I think if we were to tease into what really happened behind the scenes at Calgary 2026, we'd see a lot of that, people kind of waking up to that accountability half of that equation, to make sure that evaluation isn't just something we say we do, but it's something we actually act on.
Thank you. Rob, your opening comments suggested that you might have a few things to say about the role that others might play.
I really like the direction that the responses are headed, because we're almost seeing sport itself, I think, waking up to the possibility of being a leader, and not to focus completely on the IOC here, but Agenda 2020, which is the new policies that they've taken on by themselves as an organization, do talk about being a global leader in sport, which I think is really important. I mean, there's two pieces there. They've talked about being a global leader in a social institution that they believe can foster social change. And they've taken that on as a policy that they have been largely responsible for creating. So I think that's important as well. There is this piece within the Agenda 2020 where they say they've talked to, I think, 40,000 people around the world many stakeholders, many big transnational organizations, and they feel like their own legitimacy and viability is tied to being attached or being a social institution that makes change. And so I think that's pretty crucial. And I think the nice thing we can do as researchers and academics is to push them. They've said it, they've written it down, and all we have to do is point to it on a consistent basis. And I think we can help be responsible for these powerful actors making a difference.
Matt or Kevin, you have anything to add?
Just one quick thing. I mean, I think we should distinguish between mega events or tier 1 events, because the level of politics and power is at a completely different scale than small to medium events. And I thought it was interesting to focus on those for my research because A, it could avoid some of those politics, B, get access to data. But also it was interesting for me to think about, do we have more influence there? And I think in some cases we do. There's a lot of nimbleness and flexibility you can have with smaller events, which in total make up a much bigger proportion of the total activities or impacts globally. And so, for example, working with international sport federations like Beach Volleyball Federation, they put in some requirements that every beach volleyball event around the world had to do a few things around sustainability. Those don't make the news, but in some, they're very, very important. And you have some really cool things, like some events that will literally have zero materials used. Everything is, zero waste, zero materials, bike only. There's some really fun examples where you can really push the envelope. I think one that has always stuck with me was the Motorcycling Federation at the time introduced a new electric bike discipline. And as a result, the electric bike industry just took off worldwide very quickly because they were starting to test and try some new innovative technologies. So I think that's also where we should think at the level of where we can have some influence to do some interesting innovations.
Great, thank you. Rob, I'm going to ask you to start on this next one. So this today has been positioned, I guess, against a backdrop of the climate crisis and the UBC's stated response to that. I'm wondering, Rob, what you think, and this, of course, would be the whole panel to comment on if you would like after. What are your thoughts about the value of sport or the role of sport in moments of crisis?
I'll just reiterate the fact that I really believe that sport is a social institution that's become increasingly prominent, and I think it's begun to notice that it has a powerful voice, and that's a positive piece. If I could turn the example a little bit to talking about the cancellation of the 2020 Olympics, or the postponement, I suppose. I think it's a kind of an interesting moment where you have a host in Japan that has an international reputation for peace, and it has been a global leader. And we have an IOC that, as I just mentioned, has put out a policy that says that they want to be sensitive to being a global leader in sport, helping to make change. I think the combination of those positions, the cancellation or the postponement of the games as an opportunity, which I think is very strange language. I realize that postponing the games is an opportunity, but I really, really think that it should be considered very, very carefully. And in its stead, instead of bringing elite amateur and professional athletes together, I suggest that they host, but I think what they can host is something very different, and that is a gathering, or not a gathering, but a convening of folks, not in a physical sense, around key sustainability issues internationally. And we could talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. We could talk about peace. We can talk about equity. We can talk about all of these things as a replacement to an athletic event, and the purpose being to show sport in its many dimensions, some of which are new. And so I just really encourage this idea of sport accepting the fact that it has ascended as a social institution and has the opportunity to be a leader at a time when we need leadership, in a time when some of our traditional institutions like family, like religion, like education are struggling to be a voice. Sport is not having that difficulty right now. And so that that might be a kind of response to a real world event and a conversation that's going on right now.
Great, thanks, Rob. With time in mind, I'm going to move to the next question, partly because it relates to the response that Rob just offered. So the next question and the question after, then we're almost there, to open it up, have to do with some concrete recommendations that the panel might offer for moving forward on these issues, both more broadly as well as at UBC. And I should say that one of the things that the UBC sustainability ambassadors who we're working with on this event will be doing is at the end of this is actually putting together a list of recommendations and sending those on in hopes there might be some action around those. So with that backdrop, the next question then, Matt, I have you first up, Kavi, Caitlin, but any others who want to respond to it is, I'll ask then about recommendations. Do you have recommendations about how to assess sport event hosting opportunities in light of the climate emergency or other environmental concerns? What does a preferred future look like for you with respect to sport event hosting strategy? I know you've already alluded to this, but in a way this is, I guess, helping us form up, like, what might this look like in real terms?
I think I'll focus. Is that off? Test, test. There we go. I had to turn it on again. I think I'll focus on something a little bit different than what I've been talking about in terms of footprint. You know, all the time I've spent working with events and managers and athletes, I think the most, and actually the work that I do now at UBC around commitments for well-being, the most important thing we can do is make sure it's a centrally held value and principle guiding all of our work. So part of the reason why I talked about how do we understand sustainability and how should we talk about it is I think that's a conversation to have early on with all the major stakeholders. Whether you're organizing an event, whether you're setting up a bid strategy, a hosting strategy, decision making, and just think, is sustainability or health and well-being a guiding principle to inform everything that we're doing? And from there will flow out 1,000 decisions that can be very powerful and innovative. And then you're not having to ask for, please improve this or do that or improve something else, but you actually can engage with the community as well around what does this look like if we really set our sights onto something ambitious. Let's think about the fact we're in a climate emergency. And I think this is something UBC is doing really well. We have our students pushing us, and the board, maybe you can speak to that, Kev, even, pushing us to think about how it informs our everyday decisions now at an institutional level, and why shouldn't we do that for sports as well?
Thank you.
Two comments. One is I do think a policy framework can really assist this. I think about how many are familiar with Safe Sport? A few. So Safe Sport is something that so Safe Sport, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's basically a policy, a framework in place that allows athletes to be treated fairly and safely from coaches, free of abuse. And the policy lens that worked really well is that the federal government required, as a priority for their funding, for the NSOs to have a Safe Sport policy in place. So, lo and behold, many of the NSOs have it in place and it's functioning really well. It's a good example. I mean, that's the hammer and the nail, but that's not always needed to be that forceful. But often, think about a lot of the sport events that come, especially those mid-tier, require municipalities, provincial governments, and federal governments to provide dollars to offset the events. So, but currently, there's no existing framework for those mid-tier events where there's a requirement around a certain sustainability goal. And I think that's due not to the fact because it's not a priority, there's no clear indicator or tool to apply to it. There are measures in place. And so I think that policy lens would be really important. And I also, speaking to what Nat's comment was, I just recently joined the Board of Governors as the staff rep, so I was part of the team that supported and endorsed the climate emergency. But certainly there's absolutely, from having a seat at that table, having a high student advocacy and voices that are contributing to really constructive comments and thoughts and pressure around making change does make an impact. So I think as a sort of call to action, those type of actions do really help make real world decisions as well.
Thanks, Kathy. Caitlin, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the most important question that any potential host jurisdiction can ask themselves is How can you best leverage this event to achieve your existing long-term objectives? Not the IOC's objectives, not FIFA's or any other bodies, but what can and does this event potentially do for you? And the greatest chances of success come from when Legacy matches existing and identified needs. I think one of the big reasons why Vancouver is remembered as such a success in the city is because of, the at least 4 major infrastructural projects that the Games left behind. So, the upgrades to Sea to Sky Highway to make it safer, faster, more efficient, the installation of the Canada Line, these were things that were always on the books. But hosting the events in a lot of ways catalyzed that activity, and it brought them to the fore, and it happened a lot faster than they would have had the events not come to play. So I think if you can really answer that question of what is this event going to achieve for you and why, that's really the conversation that you need to have. And I think, the opposite side of that is that there's an opportunity cost because none of us took a SkyTrain line out to UBC this evening. So for everything that you can do, there's also things that are being traded instead. And then the next question that I think any event host really has to ask themselves is that if change is happening successfully and in the direction that you're hoping for, how do we know? And this is where evaluation is so desperately needed, and the part of this conversation to advance further, that it's not enough to try your best, but we need to know. And that accountability side of the equation really has to stand up against those promises and those commitments.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to, in the same genre of question, I'm going to move to the next one. And Phoebe, I might lead with you on this one. So building on the last question, recognizing that you all have connections to UBC, do you have recommendations for how those who are part of the sport community at UBC could be and should be dealing with sport-related environmental issues generally and perhaps the climate emergency specifically? Phoebe, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would start by just saying, or encouraging students, I don't know how many are in the room, but hopefully the message gets out to them, but encouraging student athletes to not shy away from engaging with issues outside of sport or things like environmentalism and bringing them into their sports community, because those are such strong communities, and when you have a team of 20 plus people going towards something, a lot can happen, and it's very powerful. So I would definitely encourage them to work in that sense. And I think another really important thing would be to create channels between different bodies at UBC where student athletes and anyone who's interested in improving the environmental impacts of sport events or just the day-to-day things that go on in sport teams, creating channels where issues can get to different bodies that can be of use to each other. So like places like the Climate Hub or like sustainability ambassadors, creating groups like the one we created this year actually through Center in Sports Sustainability is really useful for this. Like something that's going on right now, actually, we recently got an email from the girls' soccer team, and they were small things like reducing the plastic for ice packs. I know Matt talked about little things like that don't necessarily add up, or one car driving here is like exponentially worse. But I would argue that little things like that maintain hope and maintain kind of the vigor in this fight against the climate emergency and just things that we will be experiencing in our lifetimes. And so, although those might not make a large, decrease in our carbon footprints, I would argue that it maintains our, hope and kind of our engagement in the issue, rather than just saying, I have no control over this, it's up to, Cavi here to do everything, but I feel kind of hopeless. So, creating avenues for student athletes to link to bodies around campus that could be of use to them, I would advocate for. So, thank you.
Great, thanks, Phoebe. So we are getting near the end, but I would like everybody to have a shot at this particular question. I think it's just particularly pertinent. So, Matt, I see you ready to go.
Yeah, I was ready to go. We are in a serious climate emergency, so I think that's the thing to keep in mind. We really have to act fast and at a drastic level to be able to get back to any sort of recover from some of our state of overshoot. So individual actions are probably too late. They're important, they're part of getting people engaged and onboarded, but it's too late to focus on that. And so if I would argue against myself, I'd say a tool like that is useful for some purposes, but it's actually not going to be the thing that gets us to significant change. What we need to do is start thinking about advocacy and sort of changing our whole story and value So can sport or athletes be advocates, or youth in particular be advocates to encourage our politicians and our world leaders to really make significant change? I mean, I think that's maybe the interesting thing to really focus on now. What's the opportunity for sport or for UBC athletes to be advocates for much broader systemic change? And do the individual actions too, but yeah, I just think the emphasis has to shift away from that.
Great, thank you. What else? Rob, do you have thoughts on this one, about UBC specifically?
Yeah, to UBC. UBC is a community, and it contains within it a kind of gamut of individuals now, and it would be very important, I think, for us to engage in research-based experimentation on the entire UBC community, to think carefully about how sport can fit into sustainable society. When I talk about experimentation, maybe we discuss physical literacy as opposed to individual sports for young people up to a particular age. And in doing so, we broaden the definition of sport, and sport becomes less and less about making your way into an elite, amateur, or professional setting, so that you appreciate the more physical, emotional, and social aspects of it, which in turn broadens your notions of sustainability. I think the social piece is always given short shrift. And if we think about sports and its social dimensions and how we can choose alternatives to the way that we do sport now, we might be able to become a place that has that as one of our areas of expertise, and I'd really encourage that.
Great, thanks, Rob. Kavi and Caitlin, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think some of the most interesting work in terms of athlete activism that's happening right now in the environmental area is coming from athletes themselves. So I think International Surfing Federation is on the forefront of this one. So knowing full well that climate change is affecting the oceans that they're going to surf in, that's a big piece. Protecting our winters, POW, a bunch of athletes, Olympic athletes based in Whistler, and locally as well, that are really coming together to say, these are the changes we need to see in our sport. And it's not just from a selfish perspective of, I need this so I can keep doing my sport, but there's an awareness of, and more of an integration in terms of how athletes see themselves in the world. So, you know, with the rise of social media and any kind of technology, I think athletes' platform, no matter how famous that athlete may or may not be, really gives rise to really interesting forms of activism, which you would certainly know from your work, Brian, but that's certainly, yeah, a really interesting foray, is that athletes that depend on and live in the environment are really attuned to this right now, and potentially one of the next great areas for change.
Great, thank you. Kavi,
yeah, I would just one of my opening comments is really around dichotomies in our sort of today's society. I think about our over-reliance on fossil fuels to function as a society. As like, so what is this? The question for me is, what is the systems change versus I think there's a lot of pressure being put on politicians and leaders is that from the advocacy side of it, but without a real clear indicator of what is that system change. Are there actions needed and actions needed now? But what can we collectively do from the systems change lens that can, you know, remove the burden of our overall reliance on fossil fuels? I think is a real. I think that's the, you know, the key problem from my perspective that needs to be solved.
Great, thanks so much. So we're at time. I'm going to spill over just a little bit. If you need to leave, then take off. But I'm not going to ask the last question that I had, but I will tell you what it was, because I think it is pertinent for those of us in Vancouver looking to the future. I was going to ask the panel, and I'm going to pass it to you for a few minutes if you have 2 or 3 questions just for the audience, and then we'll give Andrea the last word. But I was going to ask, or just note that for those of you who've been reading the news recently, that John Furlong, who is president and CEO of the 2010 Vancouver Olympic Organizing Committee, publicly stated that Vancouver should bid to host the 2030 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So just maybe that just sits as a backdrop to the conversation that we've had as to whether that's a good idea, and if it is a good idea, how that should be pursued. I don't think we have time to do that today, but unless somebody chooses to ask the panel about that. So I'm just going to leave just a couple of minutes. If you have 1 or 2 questions. Yes.
Well, first let's thank Brian for moderating, facilitating this conversation. He's a really thoughtful perspective, and there's a lot, you know, he is the director of the Center for Sport and Sustainability, so I'm keeping these conversations happening, so thank you, Brian. I've been referring to this as the class reunion grant, The reason, I guess, I even started pursuing this grant and contacting a lot of these panelists was because I did my PhD here just before 2010 or during 2010, as did Matt, as did Caitlin, as did some of my others in the room. And, we came to UBC because of the Vancouver Olympics, many of us. It was the most exciting place to be studying sport. And a lot of us picked projects that had to do with the Vancouver Games. And, the Olympics are kind of like a PhD. You spend 4 or 5 years. It's all consuming, it's your everything. And then it happens at the end. And you wonder, what did that matter? And that was the idea here, was can we return to some of those really interesting conversations that were happening in 2010 and return to some of that research that was being done by grad students and by researchers at UBC and see how has that research changed perhaps our understandings of sports, of the impacts of sport events, but also how has the world changed in the last 10 years? Or maybe some of the findings, in 2010 that seemed really, really hard to think that you might get the IOC thinking about sustainability, and maybe it still is, but it's certainly a more viable option now than it was 10 years ago. So that's the whole notion behind this CSS Legacy Series, is throughout 2020, we're going to hold about 6 or 7 of these events. Each will have a different topic. They won't all be environmentally related. One's going to be on athletes and activism. One's going to be on sport and reconciliation. And what was the role of the 4 host nations in 2010? And what did they see come from that? We're going to be exploring just the role of sport in social justice. And some of them will have more environmental focuses because that is a huge priority of ours. So I thank you very much for coming out tonight. I hope to see you at future events, and I hope this is a year of dialogues where we reflect on what 2010 meant for our city and also what we can learn from 2010 to ensure that sport does play that leadership role that we heard so many of the panel discussing tonight.